Hi, I'm Laura Whitburn. I teach anatomy at the Bundoora campus.
In this video, we're going to talk about somatic sensation. General sensation from somatic structures in our body registers in the primary somatosensory cortex in the postcentral gyrus, here labelled in orange. This cortex receives information from general sensory receptors in the skin and from proprioceptors in skeletal muscle, joints and tendons, and so ultimately this gives us an awareness of our physical body, of anything that is touching our body and of movement of our body. People with damage to this part of their brain would experience a lack of conscious sensation in that part of the body, corresponding to the part damaged. The somatosensory association cortex is located just caudal to the primary somatosensory cortex, and here it's coloured in green. It receives information from the primary somatosensory cortex and integrates it with information from other parts of our brain. For example, memory or cognitive areas or other sensory areas, in order to form an understanding of that raw sensory data that initially registered in the primary somatosensory cortex. People with damage to this part of their brain could put their hand in a bag and find an object and be able to feel the shape and dimensions of that object, but be unable to recognise what that object is. So going back to the primary somatosensory cortex in the postcentral gyrus, the primary somatosensory cortex is somatotopically organised, meaning that the entire body is represented spatially in the primary somatosensory cortex of each hemisphere. For example, all the sensory neurons from the foot all head to the medial part of the primary somatosensory cortex, as you can see here. This helps the brain to know where the stimulus is located on our body. What's interesting is that there isn't the same ratio of cortical tissue to size of that body part. Instead, the amount of cortical tissue reflects the density of innervation in that particular body part, and therefore the level of sensitivity or sensory acuity. So, for example, the hands and the face are much more densely innervated, and therefore there is a lot more cortical tissue dedicated to sensation in these areas. In fact, if we created a model of the body based on how much cortical tissue is dedicated to each part in the primary somatosensory cortex, it might look like this. This is the sensory homunculus. Homunculus is Latin for little man, so he is the little man in our primary somatosensory cortex. And you can see from the sensory homunculus's large hands and large lips and generally his large face that there is a large amount of cortical tissue in the primary somatosensory cortex dedicated to sensation in those areas of his body. You can see that his trunk and legs are quite small relative to the hands and the face. And that tells us that there is not much cortical tissue dedicated to sensitivity in these areas. But that's actually okay, because we don't need as much fine control of these parts of our body, or we don't need to use the skin in those parts of our body to explore our environment in detail. So we don't need as much sensory acuity in those areas. Understanding the somatotopic organisation of the primary somatosensory cortex is really important because brain injuries may only affect one particular part of the postcentral gyrus, and therefore someone may lose sensation in only one particular part of their body. So if someone has damage to the medial aspect of their primary somatosensory cortex, they may lose sensation in their contralateral lower limb. whilst damage to the more lateral region might affect sensation in their contralateral hand or face. When it comes to how the sensory information makes its way from a receptor up to the cortex, we can think of it very simply like this. It's a 3-neuron pathway that ends in the primary somatosensory cortex. So we have one neuron here, the second neuron here, and the third neuron here. The pathway starts with a stimulus, and that stimulus is detected by the receptor here, which is on the end of this first neuron, which is our first order neuron, also known as a GSA. This GSA carries that message through the peripheral nervous system to the spinal cord or brainstem, where it will synapse with a second order neuron. So this neuron here is called the second order neuron. The first thing a second order neuron will do is crossover or decussate. So that's a general rule you can remember. After decussating, that second order neuron will always head to the thalamus. So that's another general rule you can remember. And at the thalamus, it will synapse with a third order neuron. That's the final neuron that will then carry that information from the thalamus to the primary somatosensory cortex. We can think of the thalamus in general as being like a gatekeeper, in that anything that wants to enter the cortex must first synapse in the thalamus, and the thalamus will then direct it where to go next. So in this case, the thalamus is telling that message to travel via this third order neuron to the primary somatosensory cortex. So all somatic sensory pathways follow this same general pattern. I'd now like you to check your knowledge by having a go at the following questions and posting your ideas on the discussion forum.